Well, it's always a delight to be at the University of Winnipeg, but particularly in this room because I actually graduated from high school in this very place many years ago. It saved me from what otherwise might have been quite a different fate, and I always will be appreciative of the University of Winnipeg, not only the collegiate, but also the campus itself, because I did work here for several years and enjoyed every minute of it. Many of you may not know an awful lot about the Business Council of Manitoba, so I'll just take 1 minute to explain its genesis and why it is that I'm standing here. It really came out of two headlines in the Winnipeg Free Press. The first was, "Jets leave town," and the second was, in the flood of 1997, that the Elmwood Cemetery was underwater. So one person said to the other, "Even the dead are leaving Manitoba." So we had lost a hockey team and we were in the midst of a malaise. So business leaders said it's time that there was a constructive voice among those who chose to do their business and live their lives in Manitoba, and the Business Council was formed. It's a group now of 70 chief executive officers of Manitoba's leading companies, and our mandate is to advocate those public policy positions that we think are future-oriented, that look beyond today and look generationally at the kind of Manitoba that we want to leave. So I will talk to you a little bit about our vision of Manitoba's future, not only its economy, but its people and its prospects. And I asked Bob to put a map out just so we can have some basic reference to a geography that's very well known to us, but it's always good to be reminded about the expanse of that geography. So what better place to start but in the north? And I want to say something about a vision of the pioneer and overcoming odds in order to make a vision a reality. How many of you remember back to 1867 when Canada became a nation? A couple of you do. There was John A. Macdonald, who looked to the south and saw that Ulysses S. Grant, the President of the United States, full of himself after victory in the Civil War, wanted to annex Canada because it was the best real estate opportunity since Alaska. In London, there was a change of government, and there was a policy of decolonization coming out of Westminster, so all the troops came out of Canada and went back to Britain. At the same time, Joseph Howe, who was the greatest orator of the day in Nova Scotia, was really a separatist and wanted no part of the Parliament of Canada, and the Nova Scotia legislature was full of people who didn't really want to have anything to do with this newfound confederation. Meanwhile, Louis Riel, a couple of miles from here, was asserting the primacy of the Métis Nation. And all the while, the Americans had already built a railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So that's what John A. Macdonald was facing in 1867. We think we've got problems. So the context and the segue is to the north, and the incredible prosperity that awaits us in the north of Manitoba and in the north of Canada, if only we have the wit to take advantage of it. So I want to spend a few minutes on what might be called a northern vision. You know that as a result of federal legislation, and I'm not going to say it was good or bad, the Canadian Wheat Board no longer has a monopoly on the marketing of grain, marketing of wheat. So the Port of Churchill, which has relied almost exclusively on bulk commodity of grain being exported abroad, now has to find other commodities in order to remain viable. So we have to come up with the future of the Port of Churchill that's sustainable, that doesn't depend on federal subsidies in order to go from year to year and from hand to mouth. So a northern vision has to look at the opportunity that our only inland port can offer. Well, how about, and I ask you to dream here for a minute, if we started to move some of Alberta's oil resources to northern Manitoba for export internationally? Do you know that the world is absolutely hungering and thirsting for Canadian energy? You also know that the United States intends to be self-sufficient in energy within the next 20 years because of the introduction of shale gas and how the new economics of energy in the continent and the world is changing the game for everybody. I've just come back from 2 weeks in India. What a marvelous nation India is. It is our future. Do you know that India graduated 550,000 engineers last year? That most of its power is coal generated, not clean energy? In meetings with business leader after business leader, they have an interest in accessing clean energy from North America. We have to expand our export markets in order to become viable in the long term, to take advantage of the natural resources that have been gifted to us. And Churchill, if we play our cards right, and if we understand the environmental realities of moving bitumen across, offers us a real opportunity. Secondly, we have this tremendous resource called Manitoba Hydro. Here's another interesting story from India. We met with one business leader who told us that they were just about to finish a coal-fired electricity plant that was going to generate 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Do you know how many megawatts of electricity we generate a year in Manitoba? 2,500. One plant in India produces 40% of the energy we produce in Manitoba Hydro in a given year. The appetite for energy is growing at 20,000 megawatts a year in India. The same is true in China. The world is there for us. We can access it if we do it sensibly and intelligently. But Manitoba Hydro is faced with a very difficult decision, and I understand the conundrum, because when you build a power plant, you build it for generations. It's not for tomorrow, it's for 60 years from now, 80 years from now, but you have to make the decision today. So multi-generational, multi-billion-dollar decisions have to be made at an economic moment in time and at a political moment in time, which is very difficult. Manitoba Hydro is now faced, along with the Public Utilities Board, to decide whether or not to spend $20 billion on producing more hydroelectric power in northern Manitoba at a time when that generation is becoming more and more crowded out by the discovery of new sources of energy. Well, I would argue that hydro is clean, hydro is renewable, hydro is in demand, and hydro should be developed, but only after we've got all of our ducks in a row. And then there's the controversy that you'll all know about whether or not the hydro line, the bipole that takes that hydroelectricity from northern Manitoba to the south, should be built on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, or on the west side of Lake Manitoba, or as John Gerard says, right underneath the lake, which, by the way, is a great metaphor for politics in Manitoba. The Tories want to put it here on the right side of the province, the NDP want to put it here on the left side of the province, John wants to put it in the middle of the lake. Wherever the transmission line goes, it is going to have to travel through First Nations territory, and I want to talk about that. When are we going to finally figure out that there are no deals to be made on resource development that crosses First Nations territories without the consent and the partnership of First Nations communities? And I don't have to tell the people in this room or the people at the University of Winnipeg how important that is. There is a duty to consult, but there's more than that. There is a duty to partner with those whom have lived on the land for thousands of years. And if we think that we can develop those resources without that kind of pure partnership, we're sadly mistaken. And I don't have to remind all of us of recent developments to make that point. Now I want to turn to another northern issue, and that is the quality of education in our reserve communities, which is a national and a provincial disgrace. A grade 12 education is really a grade 9 education. The funding formula that transfers dollars to students on reserve is 2/3 of what other Manitobans receive as a part of their birthright for education. Why should my children and your children have better access to a better education than children born in reserve communities? Does anybody want to try and answer to that question? Well, there is no morality that will sustain an answer, and there is no practicality, and there is no reasonable explanation why we are disadvantaging people who already are born at tremendous disadvantage because of historic poverty and deep-seated issues that we have to begin to solve. The Business Council of Manitoba every year, along with its partners, the governments of Canada and Manitoba, give bursaries to Aboriginal students across the province. We started doing this 12 years ago. We've now given out $4.5 million to more than 1,200 bursary winners. And you know what? The success rate among that group of 1,200 is better than in the non-Aboriginal population. We know that many of these young people have already overcome barriers because they are at university. We say to give young people a chance to fulfill their aspirations through education is the generational answer to generations of underdevelopment and poverty. And we in the Business Council are committed to do our part to make that happen. So I say that Northern Manitoba is our future because of the richness of our natural resource inheritance, because of the unbelievable potential of young Aboriginal people who live in the North, that if we work hard, play our cards right, I think we have a chance to lead the world in the production of clean energy. One other note on that. In October of 2009, the Business Council called a meeting of the presidents of all of the major think tanks in Canada, and guess what? They came. They all came, either in person, most of them, or by phone. And as far as we know, it's the first time in Canadian history that all of the presidents of the major think tanks were in the same place at the same time talking about the same thing, which is a Canadian energy strategy. Well, why have we not been talking about a Canadian energy strategy? Especially since President Obama, in his first speech after being elected in 2008, comes to Ottawa, meets with Prime Minister Harper, and during the press conference invites the Prime Minister to engage with him in a discussion of a continental clean energy strategy. So we all kind of scratched our heads at the same time and said, well, what's the Canadian energy strategy? Well, there isn't one. Why isn't there one? Because Pierre Trudeau and the National Energy Program made it impossible to talk about national and energy in the same sentence. But we've overcome that. We've overcome that because it makes sense. How can you not have a national Canadian strategy to link together the assets that are as varied and as diverse as Manitoba Hydro, Quebec Hydro, BC Hydro, ethanol production, biomass, fracking of shale gas, oil in Alberta, potash in Saskatchewan? Do we not have the wit to figure out what's in the national interest when it comes to mobilizing our energy resources? I'm talking about conservation, I'm talking about literacy, I'm talking about expansion of export markets, I'm talking about harmonization of regulation. All of this is important, all of this is possible. Finally, we have engagements of the premiers. The Council of the Federation has accepted the goal of creating a framework for a Canadian energy strategy. They have delegated their responsibility to 3 premiers, including Greg Selinger of Manitoba. We continue to work with them. I'm hopeful that our abundance, our example of the value of clean energy production will position Manitoba well as this framework moves forward. I want to turn to agriculture for a minute. Do you know what happened on January 22nd, 1901? Queen Victoria died. Do you know who was in Winnipeg that day? Winston Churchill. Why was Winston Churchill in Winnipeg on January the 22nd, 1901? Because he had just come back to Britain as a journalist from the Boer War and took his seat for the first time as a member of Parliament at Westminster. But he was broke. So the only way that he was going to raise money was to travel to North America and give speeches about his experience as a journalist in South Africa. So where did he go? He went to New York, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. Guess which city was the most lucrative when he asked for silver collection at the end of his speech? Winnipeg. And he wrote back from Winnipeg and he said, I looked out of the back window of my hotel room and I saw 8 100 miles of prairie. Someday, these people will feed the world. And we are feeding the world. And more efficiently all the time, and with better products year after year. The agricultural economy in Manitoba is strong, and it's growing. It's not as large as you might think as a percentage of total economic output, but it's a very important one that sustains a lifestyle that's very important to us. We have expanded our export markets. Technology has made it possible for us to be more efficient than ever before. And overall, in rural Manitoba, the agricultural economy is strong. Another question for you. What do you think the unemployment rate is in Manitoba, south of the Trans-Canada Highway? Winkler, Morden, Carman, Verdun. You know what the answer is? 0. Manitoba's unemployment rate south of the Trans-Canada Highway is effectively 0. The economists will say, you know, there's a transition rate where some people are between jobs, but the bottom line is that anybody who wants a job in southern Manitoba will get a job. Manufacturing, agriculture, small business, the opportunities for people coming to this part of the province are endless. Now, where are they coming from? Where are people coming from to Manitoba who want to take full advantage of what we have to offer? Well, they're coming from offshore. They're coming from around the world. Let me play a little game with you. When Canada became a nation in 1867, where were your ancestors? Shout it out at me.
Europe.
Well, Europe's a big place. Give me a country. Wales, Italy, Ukraine. Keep going. Okay, I've got eight countries in about 10 seconds. There might be a lesson in that. You were here. Well, you came from somewhere else, just 12,000 years ago. Okay. So, my point is that in any cross-section of Manitobans, with the important exception of Aboriginal peoples, and you could argue whether or not there was a Bering Strait bridge. Okay, well, I'm going to bow to your expertise. Okay. But the point is that with that notable exception, we have all come here from somewhere else, maybe because of the very liberal immigration policy of First Nations people who let us in generously. So the point is that why would we think that our future would be any less dependent on immigration than our past has been? And in 1998, Manitoba was bringing in 3,000 immigrants a year. This year it'll bring in 16,000. So that is a transformative policy change, which really is rooted in a couple of things that are worth mentioning. One is that everybody could take credit for the policy because it was given birth by the Filmon Tories and the Chrétien Liberals, and it was deepened by the Doer New Democrats with the Chrétien Liberals, deepened more by the Doer New Democrats and the Martin Liberals, and then again by Stephen Harper, a Conservative, and Greg Selinger, a New Democrat. So when everybody can take credit for a public policy, that means that it's both good politics and good policy. And the fact that enhanced immigration is good politics in Manitoba is a tribute to all of us who have either come from somewhere else or who have thousands of years on the land. And that immigration policy has been very healthy for Manitoba in every respect. So that's who we are, and we're coming from virtually everywhere, and we're succeeding. In a study that was done by Tom Carter at the University of Winnipeg recently about how these immigrants are doing in Manitoba, the conclusion was that most have their own house within 3 years. They virtually do not show up on the welfare rolls. Unemployment is very low, and most are working, not always in their own field, but are working and have chosen to stay in Manitoba. When we were first trying to convince the federal government that this was a good idea, the federal government's answer was, yeah, well, they'll just come to Manitoba and then in a week or a year they'll leave. And they'll go to Vancouver, they'll go to Montreal, and they'll go to Toronto. Well, that hasn't happened. They've stayed here. And they've stayed here because we have built a terrific quality of life. More and more young people are choosing to stay in Manitoba than that generation who saw that there was more opportunity in Toronto or Montreal or in New York or in London. Look, let's face it. if you want to be the president of an international bank, you're going to have to move to London or New York or Toronto. We're always going to lose some people to opportunities, and that's fine. It's not a bad reputation to have as a place that nurtures brainpower so significantly that people lead institutions elsewhere. We should be proud of that. We shouldn't be nervous about that. But on average, most of us are choosing now to stay in greater numbers in Manitoba than ever before. Why? Because the jobs are here. And the jobs are across a wide swath of the economy. Let me talk about a few other ones. Manufacturing. We have always had a very strong manufacturing base in Manitoba. We employ about 70,000 people across the province, mostly in southern Manitoba, but not exclusively. And we have adjusted to the currency fluctuations, and we have adjusted to the downturn in the U.S. economy. If you are manufacturing, as we are, windows, doors, building supplies, and the United States housing economy goes into the tanker, as it did, then obviously you're going to lose business, and we have lost business, but we have begun to build it back through very careful recruitment of the skilled labor we need, through diversifying our export markets. Our manufacturing sector has nearly fully rebounded from the recession of 2008 and 2009. Transportation continues to be important. If you look at this map, I'll point out that Winnipeg has 3 first-class railroads that travel through it, has a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week airport for passenger and cargo travel, has the head office of at least 6 major Canadian trucking companies, which means that we have invested, as we should have, in building a multimodal transportation center that we call Centerport. There's controversy with Centerport now because of providing those 20,000 acres with the necessary services they need, but the concept is sound. Manitoba has always been a transportation hub for one obvious reason. What's the only thing that matters in real estate? Location, location, location. So we are developing what will be the most important inland port for Canada, where all of those modes will meet and where we hope we will be able to do business with the continent in ways that we have never been able to do before, but building on a long tradition of excellence in transportation. How about arts and culture? Here we are sitting in a city of 700,000, and if you open up your newspaper, how many options are you going to have tonight? Within the next week, you'll be able to hear the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, watch the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, go to the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre, go to one of the smaller venues for folk music, some of the finest It's only the organizer. We can forgive him, eh? You know what we used to do? Well, you know what we used to do at the Canadian Club, and we used to announce this before the meeting began? Anyone who has a cell phone that goes off, $100 to the charity of my choice. Okay. And a bottle of wine. So the cultural richness is truly exceptional for the city of this size. People often speculate, well, why is that? Why does Winnipeg boast such a rich cultural life? I don't know definitively what the answer is, but I've got 2 guesses. One is climate, and the other is isolation. The next bigger city to the south is Minneapolis, to the east is Toronto, to the west is Calgary. That's a lot of real estate. And it's not always toasty outside, you may have noticed this week. So what we have tended to do is rely on each other and rely on each other to pursue cultural possibilities, and we have excelled at them. How much more time? Much as I need. So I'm bullish about Manitoba's prospects. I think that we are well positioned to excel in places where it will matter. We have brain power. We have energy. I want to talk a little bit about the political system. I know that there are people in the room who care about politics. Our expression is that when it comes to elections in Manitoba, Manitobans do not change direction, they change directors. Because Manitobans are historically in the center of the road of the political spectrum. Well, why are they in the center of the road? Because that's where the people are. And it doesn't matter if you're a New Democrat or a Conservative, the Liberals haven't governed in quite a while. But they have realized that if you want to come up with a magic formula for re-election, it's to be moderate, and it's to be in the middle. And the result is that we don't have disruptions that are violent after elections. We don't have governments who set about to undo everything that its predecessor government has done. Where do they do that? I'll give you an example. In British Columbia. So in British Columbia, when they moved between NDP governments and small c conservative governments, whatever you want to call it, liberal or social credit or conservative, you find that for the first year or year and a half of the new administration, they're repealing everybody else's legislation. So it takes them about 2 years to get onto an even keel. We don't have that in Manitoba. I'm sure John Gerard will speak eloquently about how Liberal policy differentiates from NDP policy and Conservative policy, and I'm sure it does, but not so dramatically that there would be a radical shift if the Liberals were elected, and we've seen it time and time again as the NDP and the Conservatives swap power. So that is both an advantage and it's a disadvantage, and I want to talk for a minute about the disadvantage. It tends not to produce bold policy. The NDP is now in its 4th term. Its electoral formula has been go slow, go easy, manage well. And that has been a successful electoral formula for them. Do you know that there was only one-term government in the 20th century history of politics in Manitoba? Anybody tell me who the government that was? Sterling Lyon. Why was Sterling Lyon the only exception in a century of stability where every party got at least 2 terms? Because he was perceived to have gone outside the middle of the line, the middle of the road. Now, I think historians will prove that that was more a rhetorical problem than a substantial problem, but there it is, and the record shows that Sterling had 1 term. And that's because we are stable, we're moderate. Look at it another way. We're neither east nor west. We're neither rich nor poor. We can't even decide whether the Bombers should play in the Eastern Conference or the Western Conference of the Canadian Football League. We are a moderate political culture that puts a premium on diversity, and because of that, the politics of Manitoba are stable. Some would argue we could use a little more instability through bold action. There are several bold ideas that I've put on the table today. I'm sure that over the next 3 days, Bob, many bold ideas will come forward. I think what you've done is important. You're stimulating conversation and thinking. That's exactly what the province needs. The Business Council is pleased to participate in the conference, and I thank you for the opportunity of speaking to you today, and I'd be pleased to take questions. Well, the first answer is education and equal access to education for all. And I spoke about the condition in reserve communities. That's where I would start. First of all, you have to start with a healthy child. So conditions like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and other congenital issues that produce children who are not fully able to take advantage of what society can offer them should be a priority, and the government has the Healthy Child Committee of Cabinet that deals with this. The public education system has to be properly funded and of a high enough quality so that the great socializing mechanism in any society, which is the public education system, does its job. Poverty reduction is important. As it happens, I was the founding co-chair of the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council and spent 3 years immersed in these issues. Pardon me? Well, they're doing a lot more than they did before they were formed. So I think that a serious poverty reduction strategy from government led by the Premier is essential. We have been challenging the Premier to declare war on poverty in Manitoba and appoint himself general, and enlist battalions of Manitobans appropriately tasked in order to coordinate a full court press in order to reduce poverty. We're never going to eliminate it, but we can reduce it, and the way is through healthy infants, through access to education, for dismantling barriers because of discrimination of any kind, and to have the political leadership that talks about this in every speech.
When I went to your thought, or as being representative of your troop, what you thought about the province's growing debt and on the liability issue?
Very concerned about growing debt because, we talk about how we're going to distribute wealth between health, education, social services, justice, and all the other demands on it, but we don't talk about creating wealth. And if we're spending more and more of our income on debt servicing, and if we can't find the balance between what we can afford and what we want, then the long-term prospects are very poor. And we talk about fiscal responsibility to the government all the time. They have been spending at the rate of 5%, 6%, 7% a year at a time when the economy has grown by 2%, 3%, 4% a year, which is not sustainable. Interestingly, do you know that healthcare spending has actually plateaued in Manitoba? When the NDP took power, the percentage of total spending on healthcare was 34%, and now it's 42.3%. But it has plateaued over the last few years. The Premier of Manitoba has finally said that that kind of cost escalation is not sustainable. So we are working with the government on healthcare reform initiatives that I think are beginning to work, and I think that the culture within Manitoba Health has changed significantly now so that we actually have a chance for efficiencies without people screaming that we're going to Americanize the Canadian healthcare system. Nobody wants to Americanize the Canadian healthcare system, and no one can get away with it. So let's park that one aside. So debt, prudent public finance has to be the foundation for our capacity to distribute wealth according to the ways in which we think are just. Yeah.
Said that we're politically stable. In my opinion, you can't have NDP, and then a swing to more conservative, mostly because of the NDP. I mean, it doesn't matter politically. But you spend, you reach the max, and then all of a sudden now you got to cut, which is not the popular thing to do, but it's a necessity, right?
Right.
You represent a whole bunch of the biggest business leaders in Manitoba,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
They must look at that and go, that's insane. Like, nobody would run their business that way.
We do. We don't run our business that way. We say that it's not prudent public finance, and we've been saying it for 15 years. You have to be able to make the tough decisions because there are investments that are necessary. Let me give you an example. The Business Council of Manitoba is advocating a 1% increase in the provincial sales tax. Can you believe it? All these business guys and women have achieved a consensus that we need more revenue in order to fix an infrastructure problem that in Winnipeg alone is thought to be about $7.4 billion. So you can trim here and you can nip and tuck there and release some revenue, but not enough to handle the problem. Whereas a 1% increase in the PST generates $262 million. You think the politicians will buy that? No, because they will refuse to explain to the taxpayer, even though there's a generational issue that's going to impact our kids and our grandchildren, they're not going to take the political risk. If they all agreed to do it, then the political risk wouldn't be much of an issue. Yes, sir. I know.
Thank you.
I covered that.
Please, I hope you will
Yeah.
inform the First Nation leaders and also the first and future First Nation leaders to come, to work with them, to listen to them. After all, we welcome you. I hope the Liberal Party of Manitoba will work toward the work of the First Nation people in all aspects of this life. We love to be partners with you. So please don't do it under a microscope. Because today we suffer from, we have to hunt out of our community. We have to get water, not from the perfect thing where I used to say when I was a child. Our water's dirty, our health is struggling, even as me as a persistent person here in the city, I'm struggling at the below poverty line. I certainly be, because I'm well educated like you. I have some tough experience, so please, I ask for the Liberal Party, stand firm with us. That's the only way you're gonna get into power.
Well, the first point I, of course, have to make is that I do not speak for the Liberal Party. I have not held a party membership since January of 1992, which is 21 years ago, but I can speak for the Business Council.
Keep in mind that it's for the business.
Well, not only do we keep it in mind, we keep it in the center of every argument we make to government. And I appreciate your story. Thank you.
So please, don't let us suffer no more.
Thank you.
Work with us.
Jim, if we have time for
Yeah, I'm fine.
one more question, I think, or wherever.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think I have something to say about this too, that it's pertinent. You talked about the three routes for the power coming down from the north. A really good example of the colonial concepts that run our economy. We live in a northern country. It's not much colder in Thompson area and northern Manitoba than it is here. But none of the resources that we extract from there are invested up there. And we have one of the greatest ports on the continent, and we have the source of power. And you still don't talk, and your business council still doesn't talk about using it up there. And I point out to you that every kilometer that you try to transport that stuff south, you lose. And we don't talk about using the resources in the area where the people live and where we have a growing population and where they would probably feel a lot happier than downtown Winnipeg. I would feel a lot happier up there than downtown Winnipeg. And, you know, we're talking about the future. You're talking, these things go decades in advance. Well, we should be thinking now about what we can do to have economic development in the north. And I'm telling you that all around the world, there are northern cities being built, modern northern cities that have symphonies, that have arts, that have culture, that have sports facilities, and have huge educational facilities in their boundaries that should be envisioned in northern Manitoba because that's where the people live and that's the resources are, and that's closest to the port that you were talking about. And I would like to see this conference start to talk in terms of new ideas and not this colonial ideas that this gentleman's culture has been afflicted with. We have not been developing the northern resources of Manitoba for northern Manitobans. And if we're talking about a Canadian energy policy, how about we come up with a Manitoba energy policy that deals with the people and the fresh air and the fresh water that every high-tech business in the planet is looking to locate at. And I would really seriously, three ways of colonizing the north further? No. Use the power up there. Develop the power if we need more up there. And build up there. And I'm sorry, I didn't want to make a speech. There wasn't a question. But I'd like to hear your response.
Okay. Well, I spent the first 10 minutes of my presentation on developing northern Manitoba with First Nations people. I could also have talked about the importance of creating a surface link between northern Manitoba and Rankin and Nunavut, and I could have talked about running a power line north from dam construction. We say all of these things. So I'm agreeing with the thrust of your comment, which is that the people who live there ought to be the benefit of the wealth that's created of the stuff that they live on top of. I have no problem with that.
Well, good, thank you.
Okay?
Forgive me, since my phone rang again, it just cost me $200. Pardon me?
I just want to
Sure.
ask a question about
One more, Jim?
development and sustainable development in agriculture. You never mentioned that because a lot of things that have been happening throughout Manitoba and I guess Canada that you talk about exporting, but it always displaces the people, but also displaces the environment. You know, there's no consideration of the environment. So you're talking, you know, the free roads there too. That's going to affect us as people, but not only us as people, First Nation people, we're talking all people. So when you mentioned, you didn't even mention sustainable development. You didn't mention sustainable practices around environment. You didn't mention alternative energy. Things like that that is very, very needed because of the way the future is going. We have prophecies that talk about these things that are happening. Right now, the Idaho War, that is a prophecy that has been foreseen by our ancestors. So when we talk about sustainable development and economic development, we want to talk about protecting also for future generations. But you did not mention that, so I would say back here.
Also, like to add something real quick. I just took a little bit of the notes when you were talking. You talked about the three lines that are coming through the territories. And we kind of joked about how you guys are deciding where you're going to make the line through the waters or through this area. I wanted to add what your brother was saying from Cross Lake, that there has to be consultation. But when it's consultation, it's not only to the political voice, it's also to the grassroots people. But our focus today is the women. The true title holders of this land are the women. And there needs to be talks with the grandmothers and the women that are rising up. These decisions that are being made have never been dealt with the women in this country. And you also talked about the mark down here when you talked about our. You said a lot of hours, like our natural resources are gifted to us. You know, there's so many, like, it just sounds so, like it's just taken. We don't even, our people don't even talk like that. We're the original people that take care of this land, but there's so much claim and it sounds really harsh when we say our. So I just wanted to point that out. And also you talked about the north and how the north is the focus. Everybody's focusing on the north, and you need the consultation of the people of the north. Not just claim those things like that. You need to make sure that the people of the north are sitting at the table. Those are the things I wanted to add.
Well, I think I said that, and if I didn't, I'll say it again. And it's not only about a duty to consult, but it's also the responsibility of partnership and of shared ownership of resources. And when I say our, can I not mean you and me? Can I not mean you and me?
Well, it just sounds like even we don't say our. Like our people.
Well, maybe that's a cultural difference, so you tell me what a better word would be. Well, the concept that I'm trying to convey there is that we have a shared responsibility to treat the land responsibly. I spent 8 years as the Canadian Vice Chair of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where I learned about the importance of responsible development of all resources. The Business Council respects that. We respect that we have a special obligation in partnering with First Nations people who have claims that we don't have and never will have. But when I say our, I mean you and me.
Is there not, like maybe this business council we have? Is there not First Nations as part of the business council?
There was a member of First Nations as a part of the council, and we hope that there will be many, many more First Nation entrepreneurs who will join us. And much of what we do is designed to stimulate entrepreneurial activity, not only in the general community, but particularly in the First Nations community. We have a continuing and important conversation with the Grand Chief and other chiefs for particularly that reason. Okay?
Okay, everyone, I think that's the end of this session, and I want to thank Jimmy so much for coming and sharing his views and telling us certainly a lot of things, and I loved the Winston Churchill story. So thanks very much, Jimmy.